Hi everyone, welcome to this, the final talk in the series that has run through the entire summer, studying imperial power in the Roman world. We're very fortunate today to have Professor Greg Wolfe, who is an expert in the cultural history of the Roman Empire. Greg will be talking about attitudes and ideas surrounding slavery and empire, and there will hopefully also be a bit of time for a little discussion at the end. I suspect the majority of people watching this will already be familiar with Greg's name and Greg's work. He draws both upon archaeological and historical evidence to help shape his views of the ancient world. And this has allowed him to create distinctive and quite often large-scale perspectives, new ways of thinking and interpreting the ancient past. From 2015 to 2021, he served as Professor of Classics and Director of the Institute of Classical Studies in London. And this summer, he also took up the Ronald J. Mellor Chair of Ancient History at the University of California in Los Angeles. Greg has published widely on a number of topics, and his most recent work looks at the rise and fall of ancient cities, tracing the realities of urbanism from the end of the Bronze Age onwards. And this was titled The Life and Death of Ancient Cities and Natural History. Greg is also working on migration and attitudes towards that, as well as ancient diaspora. My students, Greg, will most likely know you through your study of Roman Empire story. Mm-hmm. And we use that quite often. We certainly use it in our Empires course, but also in our second and third year modules as well. And I consider that one of the best single volume histories of Rome. And it's the one we always tend to draw upon alongside, for instance, Neville Morley's study of the Empire, as well as Catherine Steele's study of the late Republic. But there is obviously an awful lot that you've written, Greg. So if I could then pass it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad you like the Roman Empire story. The second edition comes out next week, so
excellent.
Big plug.
Good timing, very good timing.
It's very nice to be talking with you all. I'm going to just share my screen. Can you? I'm at the moment I'm host disabled screen sharing.
That's fine. I was expecting this. Let's have a look. See if that works, Greg.
Seems to, yes, I think so. Okay, so can you now see the first slide? Okay, so what I wanted to talk about is about how we connect slavery and empire in the Roman world, and they're both. So there's a number of connections you can make between them. I put some of them up here. I'll talk a bit about what's involved in connecting to historical processes partway through. But when we think about Rome, we think of it as an imperial power. We also think of it as a slave society. We often keep those two separately. We think about the empire on the frontiers expanding and slavery in the middle. I want to try and see some of the ways in which it might connect up. And one of the ways you can think about it is the question I suppose I've asked partway down. Did the empire depend on slavery? Was it driven by slavery or powered by slavery? And another way to turn the other way around and say, well, there are lots of kinds of empire. What difference did it make to the Roman Empire that it was created by a society that had for centuries owned slaves already? So we need to start, I think, with working out what we mean by slave, because this isn't quite as easy a thing to decide as might be thought. One way that we often think about it, and the way that the Romans also think about it, is the slave is in the middle of that Venn diagram. A slave is both a human being and something that can be owned. Most human beings, of course, can't be owned. Nowadays, it's almost none can be owned. Almost no place in the world where slavery exists legally, although certainly exists illegally in many forms. And we know there's things that you can own, commodities that you buy and sell, and slaves are there in the intersection of that, at the end of the Venn diagram. And Romans would have understood this very well, because they also thought about slaves as essentially property, and people bought, sold them, inherited them, passed them through the family, and they treated them often as just a slightly special kind of object, or perhaps sometimes they even talked about it as an animal, a domestic animal that could understand commands better than a dog or a horse could do more. So that's one way to think about them. But there's another way of thinking about them, which is to think that slaves are they're human beings who have been violently stripped of some of the things that are really essential to be human beings. And this definition that's associated with Orlando Patterson works much better for all sorts of other societies that don't have a strong sense of property, for example. So permanent, violent domination by natally alienated. What Patterson means is we're born with it into a family, with a set of relationships and identities. And enslavement for him is when that's ripped away and people are denied a chance to participate in their past, their heritage, and they're forced into a new mode. And that's what he means by social death. So not just about property, about all sorts of other kinds of marginalization. I think we can think about the Roman world with both of these versions of slavery in mind. There's some modern definitions as well. These are ones connected with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, Anti-Slavery League, and I've put these up here, but perhaps the most important bit on this slide is the last sentence, which is to say, well, as far as we can tell, virtually all societies in the past had some kind of slavery or another. Might look quite different to the slave systems that we're familiar with in relation to ancient Greece and Rome, or that are part of the recent heritage of North and South America. But virtually every society has some kind of slavery, in that expansive sense of people who are treated as if they're not people, who are made to do things that others want them to do for the benefit of others and not themselves. And so Rome isn't unusual to having slaves. What's unusual is how many it had and the range of things they did. So what do slaves do in Roman society? Grumio looking grumpy on the side there. Well, they do almost everything. Or rather, they do all those things that other family members can't do. And one way to think about slavery is that it's a way of expanding your society slightly. You have a plot of land to work. You don't have enough adult male children or semi-adult children to do it. So you get a slave to help out. Or there are tasks that you don't want to do yourself but a slave will be brought in to do them for you. Perhaps certain kinds of cleaning or menial labor. And you can see now why I put that second definition up, because our own society has got tasks that most British citizens don't want to do themselves. Now, we don't use slaves to do it, but we have other ways of bringing in people who will do it for less money or less security or less safely than we'd be prepared to do. What do slaves not do in the ancient world? They don't fight. They don't do justice, they don't vote, they don't stand for office. So these things under the third bullet point, those are the preserve of the citizen. And there's one other thing that they don't do. It's not usually very economical to get a slave for just to do something you only need occasionally. So people did buy and hire laborers to do things like pick grapes when it was the vintage, or unload parcels from boats on the docks when it was time for that to happen, because you don't need the slave for the rest of the year. But anything you might have a more or less constant need for, slavery was the go-to solution. So the range of things they do, they work in the house. This is probably the first thing we know they did. All those domestic occupations, companions, hairdressers. Here's a nice image from Gaul of a noblewoman sitting in a wicker chair surrounded by hairdressers, and one of them is holding up a mirror. That's what that round object is. It's not a vertical pizza. And holding up a mirror so the woman can look at herself. So she's having her hair done by somebody, and then someone else holding that. And all these other people, apart from the woman in the chair, are slaves. And we can find more and more images of that. We can find the slaves, the pedagogus, the slave teacher who takes children to school, slaves who man the door, the januarius who stands at the janua, the door of a house to let people in and out, the porter, the entrance porter, all these sorts of things. And these revolve around the house that the owners are in at the moment. And then there's work they do outside the house, that slaves, and particularly ex-slaves, often work in areas of business that belong to the slave owner. So the slave owner might own or rent a tavern or a small shop, or might put a slave out to work in the market doing something. So these are sort of more, if you like, more remote tendrils of a family. So the economic base is the family, but sometimes you want people to do things in a more independent way, and these are the slaves. And they also do things like run farms or run potteries or look after small bits of business. And as some Romans become richer and richer, and as their business affairs expand to the point where in the age of Cicero, many senators have 6, 7, 8 or 9 farms up and down Italy. They can only be one at a time. They need someone to stand in for them. Who do they use? They use a bailiff, a villicus, who might be a slave or an ex-slave, could be a free person, a client, but it's another way to expand your network of business affairs. Some slaves are very skilled workers. This is an actor. Some of them make jewelry. Something that's really only just come up in recent work is that slaves are actually involved in almost every stage of producing literature. When Pliny the Elder sits down to eat, he has a slave who reads out a book to him and another slave who acts as a sort of highlighter pen. Every so often he'll say, write that down. So this is a way of excerpting from a book. You have one slave who reads and one slave who takes notes. When Pliny the Younger composes something, he does it in his head until he's got it absolutely right. Then he calls a slave to write it down for him. So you dictate to slaves. Then the slaves produce the fair copy. The slaves, the calligraphers, they produce the original manuscripts, and then they do copies to be sent out because there's no printing press in the ancient world. And slaves also look after libraries and correspondence, like Cicero's slave Tyro. So all that literary culture we see the ancient world through, almost all of it has involved skilled slaves. And then, of course, slaves also do really hard labor. They work in the mines, they work on farms. And these things you've got on the left here are they're rotating mills. And so if you have a look at them, they're huge, great big slabs of stone, and you put the grain or whatever you're going to grind underneath it. And then this has to be turned around. So great timber is put across. And so it works horizontally. And slaves push it the way that donkeys might in other societies, or mules. So really, really tough labor. We've got a few descriptions. That sounds absolutely awful. Now, what do we know about the history of Roman slavery? Well, there are slaves in Rome as early as we can see Rome, which is the 12 Tables, a law code written in the 5th century. And it's presumed there that these law codes are really applied to relations between citizens, but it's assumed there that some will have slaves. As Rome begins to expand overseas, so this is the coming of empire, more and more slaves are brought in and captured. And then they get put to work, particularly on all these new properties that the Romans are accumulating as some of them become quite rich. So all those multiple farms, but also looking after the tower blocks when they build houses for rental, working in the potteries and the brickyard. So as the economic interests of the Roman aristocracy grow, slavery gets out of the household and it gets out into the field, into the quarries, into the clay pits, onto the boats, and so on. And by the turn of the millennia, by the end of the Roman Republic, it's calculated through maybe more than a third the population of Italy are slaves. There's 2 or 3 million slaves. So half the population of London maybe are slaves in Italy at the end of the last century BC. Now, slaves carry on having throughout the Republic and the late Republic and the early Empire, when they show up much more clearly because we have inscriptions and statues of them. And even when Roman expansion slows, as it does under the first emperors, and they have fewer and fewer captives to make slaves of, they keep using slaves. In fact, they're using slaves well into the 4th and 5th centuries and beyond, right up, in other words, into Christian Rome and beyond, into the Rome that survives the Roman Empire, the Rome of the early Middle Ages and the popes and so on. So Roman slavery is always there, although it changes a bit over time. Now, how do we connect this with the other story of empire? And this is actually a real typical problem for a historian. You see 2 things that are happening: the history of slavery and the history of Roman Empire, happening in the same place at the same time and involving the same people. But how do you connect them? And it turned out to be much more difficult to connect than you might think. Maybe in the past, some historians thought you just say, well, one thing caused the other. Empire causes slavery. So conquest means you've got captives and then you have slaves. Or turn it around and say, well, maybe it's slavery that gives Romans the leisure and energy to make war so efficiently, so slavery causes empire. But as soon as you start thinking about it, you find the connections are much more complicated. So it's more like we've got two sets of processes that are entangled. And maybe not only two, maybe others as well. So other things people think might be important are the growth of the city of Rome, for example, which grows to nearly 1 million people at the end of the Republic, or the spread of cities throughout Italy and then the empire, or the spread of Roman taste. So some of those images I showed you, like the woman in her wicker chair, come from Roman provinces. So does a Roman habit of slave owning spread out? So how do all these processes knit together? It's quite a difficult thing to do as a historian. It's always tempting to try and find a simple, strong narrative. And the more you push one of them, the story of slavery or the story of empire, the more the other gets pushed into the edges. So the real difficulty in history is working out how to form that network of connections, of things that explain each other rather than cause and effect. So this is one historian's solution. It's to do a sort of complicated diagram. This is from Keith Hopkins, who's one of the people who supervised my PhD thesis a long time ago. And you might, if you have a quick, you might see, for example, up in the top left-hand corner, he talks about how once Rome is waging wars, this leads to plunder, and the plunder brings booty, wealth, and taxes and slaves to Italy. And this leads to some people can now afford bigger estates and they buy slaves to work them. And maybe this means that they're buying estates at the expense of other people, so other people get dispossessed. And maybe that leads in a more complicated way to people moving into towns. And what's hot now, you could think of more boxes and you could connect them in different ways. But the point that he's trying to make is these processes are all unraveling at the same time. And there are lots of, you could think of those feedback loops, couldn't you? The more Rome fights, the less time the citizens have to farm the land. So the more slaves they need, the more they fight, the more slaves they get, and so on. And it's ideas like this that we need to think of. We're trying to think about how Rome as a society gets hooked on both empire and on slavery. Now, there's different ways of doing that. Another way is a Marxist way to think that Rome undergoes a sort of sudden shift in gear where its whole economy runs on slavery. It's like fossil fuels or electricity. You suddenly get a new power source that enables you to do new things. And so people who believe in a slave mode of production, I'm not one of them, but those who do think that at some point enough slaves came into Rome through conquest to allow the Roman aristocracy to upgrade the model, to build these great rural farms involving lots of slaves, educate at all levels, educated slaves to run them, bailiffs, manual workers, and then the manual that Cato the Elder writes in agriculture has a lot to say about it. It also has a lot to say about other forms of labour. And this villa of Sette Finestre is one of those that was dug by one of the great Marxist archaeologists, Italian Marxist archaeologists in the late 20th century. Now, when we ask where the slaves come from, there's only 3 ways you can get slaves, more or less, in 3 ways in the ancient world. One is to buy them. One is to have people who are born as slaves because their mothers were slaves. And the Roman law, doesn't matter who your father is, who matters who your mother is. If your mother's free, you're born free. If your mother's a slave, you're born a slave. And this is a convenient legal fix if you think about it, because anyone who's ever looked at society with lots of slave women in knows that the fathers are not always slave men. In other words, we should imagine routine levels of sexual exploitation and lots of slaves who are unacknowledged children of their masters. So that's the second route. But then the third way is enslaving captives. And this is the way to get slaves really quickly and also relatively cheaply, because a slave trade turns out to be quite an expensive way of buying slaves. So here's enslavement, the captives. And this goes back all the way to Homer. Greek drama in particular is preoccupied in several plays, the Hecuba, Andromache, the Trojan women, with the fate of the women of Troy after Troy has fallen. They know they're going to be slaves, they're going to be Some of them are going to become concubines of the Achaean conquerors. Some of them are going to watch their husbands killed. Some of them watch their children killed. And it's not just about epic. This happened in real life in the 5th century. The men of Mytilene to be killed and the women and children to be enslaved by the Athenians, a punishment for revolt. And so the Romans are carrying on a fairly normal Mediterranean practice, the point where they burst into life in the 2nd century, conquering on the other side the Adriatic. They make a treaty with the Aetolians in the 2nd century that they will fight a campaign, and during that campaign the Aetolians can keep any of the cities and the Romans will keep any of the people. So their share of the booty is the portable, the stuff they can take back to Italy with them, and that means humans. It's huge numbers. It's said by Livy that in the campaigns in Epirus, 150,000 slaves are captured. It looks like Caesar in just 8 years fighting in Gaul, modern France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Within just 8 years, he captured 500,000 slaves. So you can imagine how cheap slaves are in this period. They're brought back and huge numbers of them available. And that if you want to suddenly expand with a slave villa or build up a slave workforce, and people thought of more imaginative ways of using them. Crassus, one of Caesar's allies, had a group of slaves he trained to be firemen, and they would wait till buildings caught light in the city of Rome. And then when the building was on fire, Crassus would offer to buy it from the owner. And eventually the owner would despair and sell it at a knockdown rate. And Crassus would send in his crack team of trained fire slaves to put the fire out, repair it, and then rent on the building. So massive numbers of slaves coming into Rome in this period. And we see pictures of captives are absolutely standard on triumphal monuments. This may show a sort of North European slave with a beard and perhaps an African slave here, although it's not very easy to tell exactly what's going on. And on Trajan's column, there's pictures of people being dragged up here, captives as well. So whenever there's wars of conquest in the empires, whereas in the Republic, slaves are brought back to Rome. And occasionally it goes badly wrong. You bring in so many slaves that you don't have a chance to discipline them and control them and socialize them. And the one period you get a lot of slave revolts, it's in this period of massive imperial expansion. So the slave revolts really start at 133, go on then in the 60s, 70s, a few other ones as well. But this seems to show that one period where Rome is importing slaves at enormous level. This is the period where enough ex-slaves can get together, find people who speak the same language as them and make common cause. There are probably little slave revolts in other periods as well. But it's not quite so simple as this relationship between empire and enslavement. Because Rome has slaves, like most people have slaves, before they start conquering. And more of a problem, they still have slaves all the way through to the late empire. So for centuries after the empire stops expanding, the empire more or less stops expanding in the 1st century CE, 1st century AD. So Augustus slows it down a lot. Most of the Roman Empire is conquered under Pompey, Caesar, and Augustus. There's little bits of conquest. Britain conquered under Claudius and his successors, Romania by Trajan, some bits of Germany as well in the 1st century. But it's all slowed down enormously from that point on. But it doesn't seem to slow down slavery. So the story of slavery and the story of imperialism, they take different routes at this point. Imperialism has sort of slowed, but slavery is still going fantastically well. Under the empire, we know a lot about slaves, a lot more about slaves, partly because we have lots of inscriptions, which we have very few inscriptions to the Republic, and they don't tend to mention slaves. They tend to be legal or milestones, whereas in the empire, we get lots of gravestones. And gravestones often mention slaves and ex-slaves, who are actually some of the most commonly attested people on the slave stones. We know that slaves are owned by everybody, by the wealthy, by the not so wealthy. So small people add 1 or 2 slaves to help them on their farm or in their shop. Aristocrats have sometimes up to hundreds. We know that at least one Roman senator had 500 slaves personally. The emperors have slaves, many, many more. Thousands of slaves belong to the emperors. Slaves have slaves, ex-slaves have slaves. Cities have public slaves, including the city of Rome, which has public slaves. Temples have slaves. When the Christian church comes along, it has slaves. So they're just absolutely everywhere. There seem to be some attempts to slow down the rate at which they're freed. So the first Emperor Augustus puts a tax. Every time you free a slave, you have to pay a share of the price to the treasury, and he limits the number who could be freed in a will. But it doesn't seem to make a big impact, and it's more and more. It's beginning to look like some cities, Herculaneum, Pompeii, maybe even the city of Rome. The majority of the population are either slaves or ex-slaves, or the descendants of ex-slaves. And one reason that's happening is we know that that many more people die in these big cities than are born in them, just because they're so unsanitary. So to keep large, they have to keep topping themselves up. And there isn't enough other sources of migration apart from slave migration. So it looks like the really big cities are kept going by constantly bringing in fresh supplies of humans. So aqueducts bring water, ships bring grain, and then slaves are brought in as well. Now, what about the static empire, the empire that is ruled by the emperors and doesn't do so much fighting? How do slaves fit in here? Well, if you look at other empires around the world, you find that although they look broadly similar at the top level, most empires are one people dominating others, drawing in tax and tributes and rent and from all over and spending it in a very small number of places. So, for example, it's been suggested the Roman Empire spends about 3/4 of its tax revenue just on the army, and most of the rest goes to the emperor, and then tiny bits go as sort of run games or facilities for people in the bigger cities. So it's a very simple economy, and empires look like that. And this would be more or less true if you looked at the Inca or the Chinese Empire or the great empires of North India, or the oldest series of empires we know about, the ones that start in Iran and go on from the Achaemenids with successors through until they become transformed into Islamic caliphates. And most of them, when you sort of open the bonnet and look under the hood, you find what's different about them depends on the kind of society that created them. So the Britain's empire in India, the British Raja it's called, was run mostly by educated lower middle class people educated in England, and it's the core of its army was from Scotland and Ireland and Wales as well as England. And so we have a sort of middle class bourgeois class orientated society that creates an empire in its own image. And this image of a civil service office here, this captures it perfectly. Look at all those ledgers, bureaucracy, a clerk at the desk, a more senior clerk supervising him, and who is standing silently in the background waiting for orders? It's the Indians. So this is a lovely image of how, well, it's an image, lovely or not, it's a good image of how the British Empire works. Educated British clerics, and then subaltern classes below who carry out the orders. And if you look at the Spanish Empire in the Americas, we find it's run very largely by priests and hidalgos and sort of aristocrats. And they've exported to New Spain the systems of government they created when they were conquering southern Spain from its Muslim inhabitants in the early Middle Age, in the Middle Ages. So we should expect that Rome's empire will run by modifying its domestic institutions to form the government system of an empire. That's exactly what it does. And this is where slaves come in. Romans are so involved in us being owners of slaves that when they come to find a language to express words that we would talk about, say, provincials or subjects or subordinate populations, British Empire used to use colony for a while without a different sense from the Roman one. Romans constantly use the language of slavery. They talk about patrimonium, the power of a master over slaves. They talk about the Britons lacking libertas. Libertas, freedom, is the quality of a freeborn person. The opposite of being free, of being a free aristocrat, is servitude, slavery. And this new book by Miles Lavin talks a lot about how that language of slavery is modified to describe the empire. And even domestically, the emperors come to be not just the bad emperors, but the good ones too. Pliny addresses Trajan as domine, master, my lord. And dominus is the Latin word for master, a slave owner. So even aristocrats address emperors, even good emperors, as if they are their masters. The emperors don't address the aristocrats as if they're slaves, but that's a matter of politeness. Now, at the very last chapter of the life of the Emperor Augustus, written by Suetonius, he talks about what was found after Augustus died. In the Vestal Virgin, the Vestals had kept for Augustus his latest copy of the will, partly written in his own handwriting, partly written in, you've guessed it, the handwriting of his slaves. He's dictating some of it. And along with the will, there are 3 little documents. And so one of them is how I want to be buried. One of them is the text of the raised gestae, which many of you will have read of, originally to be inscribed on bronze outside the mausoleum that's just reopened in Rome, but we know it from copies in the provinces. And the third one is a quick summary of what's in the empire. How many soldiers there are, how many are serving, how much money is in the treasury, what's in the privy purse, that's the money that he claimed as his own, what taxes still have to be paid, what rent have to be paid, and he adds the names of the freedmen and slaves from whom the details could be demanded. This shows you how the Roman Empire is being run in AD 14. It's being run through the domestic household of the emperor, that his slaves and his ex-slaves actually do all the work. So no civil service, no bureaucracy, certainly no aristocrats, no consuls, no one like that. It's been run through his own personal slave family. And he provides bare details, and he says to the Senate and the people of Rome, if you want to know exactly how much is owed from the Spanish provinces, this is the name of the slave who knows. So this couldn't be more clear, could it? That slavery as a means of government is at the heart of what Augustus is doing. And over time, the slaves of the emperor, what we call, and occasionally they call the family of Caesar, the Familia Caesaris, it becomes tens of thousands of them. It builds a little bit on the way in which Republican notables like Pompey used to use slaves, or Sulla. Some of them are based on the Palatine Hill and what the emerging palace, but some of them are out the provinces running affairs, running imperial estates, running mines, sorting out as procurators, and some of them are quite high status. Why trust slaves to do it? Well, partly because you're used to running your own family affairs like this, and this is the way aristocrats have run everything for generations through slaves. They don't have an educated middle class like the British Empire. They're certainly not going to employ people. There's nobody educated takes money for labour. They're not going to let aristocrats do it either, because aristocrats are the people who could replace emperors. The great thing about a slave is he's utterly dependent on his owner, or she's utterly dependent on her owner. You can trust a slave because if you ever decide you don't trust your slave, you can sell him, you can imprison him, you can even have him tortured or beaten or whatever. So slaves they do the job that robots do in science fiction. They're the people who must obey you and are probably more competent than the human beings that are not being given those jobs. Being an imperial slave is something people are proud of. No one's proud of being a slave, perhaps, but look at this beautiful cinerary urn for the ashes. And at the top of it, you can read, outlined in red, Dis manis manibus, to the shades of the dead of Tiberius, Claudius. And then the second line, can you make it aug, L, A-U-G dot L? And this is the Roman term for L is Libertas, a freed man. So this is a Roman way of saying a freed man of Augustus. So he boasts on his tomb that he is a freed man of Augustus. His given name is Chrysarotis or Chrysaros, that's the genitive. And then there's 2 women there commemorated as well. So it's a proud boast to be a slave of Caesar. We know that in the early empire, this caused some real tensions, that some of the really powerful freedmen of the emperor, and particularly in the reign of Claudius and Nero, caused huge antagonism from the Senate. So Pallas, Narcissus, and Callistus, they were so powerful that when the emperor's wife died, the three of them discussed among them, apparently, who they wanted to succeed. Each one had their own candidate. Who's going to be Claudius's next wife? Somebody we can control, someone we can mold. They were given or offered extraordinary honours, the honours of consuls or praetors. Pallas is offered praetorian honours by the Senate. So the Senate put up to this. After Boudicca's revolt, the governor who suppresses the revolt, Suetonius Paulinus, seems to behave in an increasingly authoritarian way. Nero hears stories of this and is worried that that maybe the governor is going to just create more revolts by being too harsh. What's his response? He sends one of his own ex-slaves, Polyclitus, to go and find out. So a junior aristocrat has tipped off Nero that things are getting out of hand again. Nero responds by sending a freedman. Another of his freedmen, Epaphroditus, actually staves off an aristocratic coup. As a result, he gets even more money and estate and honours. So this is what the palace is like. And the philosopher Epictetus talks about senators who are queuing to see the emperor. They can't get to the emperor because who guards the emperor's presence? The slave courtiers, the ex-slaves. You want to marry an emperor, you want to get a word with him, you need to butter up his slaves first. So the world's turned upside down. Slaves in imperial Rome, some of them, just a very few, have become more powerful than aristocrats. Where did the slaves come from? Well, we know quite a lot about this. We can see this on the left. There's the tombstone of a slave trader from Amphipolis in the northern Aegean, sort of northern Greece now. You can see at the bottom chains of slaves. So these have been brought in down from Macedonia, from the forests, down perhaps across the Danube, and have been brought to the ports where they'll be sent on. Here are some on the right. You have a line of slaves chained together at the neck, being brought to Smyrna, Izmir on the coast of Turkey, where again they'll be sold on. We know the great slaving ports of the Mediterranean, and they draw on a hinterland. And so in the Republic, the biggest port was Delos, with tens of thousands of slaves could pass through every day. In the empire, it's probably Ephesus, one of the big ones. So these really big, impressive cities, one of the things they do is they sell slaves, and the slaves put on vessels and taken to not just Rome, other cities as well. And they're sorted, of course. A well-educated slave gets a higher price. A strong or a handsome slave would do better than a weak or a feeble. Probably most of the slaves who come in are men, which is one reason why they have to bring in more slaves every generation, because they have a balanced population. If we ask where they're coming from, the place I mentioned, Ephesus and Izmir are here, Amphipolis is here. And we think slaves are coming down across the Danube. They're being brought in from the Black Sea. So being harvested, if you like, from barbarian Europe. And the other place they're harvested from is the Nile Valley, and even some brought across the Sahara as well. So slaves are being drawn into the empire from the north and the south. The reason they don't come from the east is because here you've got another empire, the Persian Empire, and they're not going to allow their subjects to be enslaved by Rome. So the Mediterranean imports tens of thousands of slaves every year, barbarian slaves mostly, who are then trained and given new roles in the cities of the empire and outside them. There's an internal trade as well. This is a wax tablet found in the city of London in 1994. Beautiful handwriting. This is a bill of sale, and what it says is this. It's a transaction between the assistant slave of an imperial slave and another assistant slave, and they themselves bought a third slave. So this is what the slave economy looks like. It's not free people with a few slaves. The slaves and ex-slaves owning and buying slaves themselves. And she isn't from outside the empire. She's from Gaul, a small tribe in northern Gaul. And she cost 600 denarii, which, if you calculate it up, is actually probably the price for a small car, a year's income for somebody who is earning better than subsistence, but not a huge amount. So slaves in the early empire are relatively expensive. The days of cheap slaves from Caesar's conquest are gone. And because you're paying good money for a slave, you want guarantees that she's healthy, that she's not a runner, and this is guaranteed by law. So this is a Roman legal document, and it's also sworn, because Rome runs on religion as much as on law. It's sworn by the genius of the Emperor Caesar. The worst runaways. This is a famous image. My last image here is of slavery from the city of Rome. And this person, this has been made to wear a collar round probably his neck, saying, "I've run away." So this is presumably somebody who run away in the past. So you think he's going to run away again? Catch me, and it promises a reward if you return him to a master named Zoninus. Receive a gold coin. Gold coins worth quite a lot. Slaves in the empire are worth quite a lot. So what I've tried to do in this talk is show you some of the ways in which the story of slaves in Rome and the story of Rome's first expansion and then its stable empire and the ruling of the empire with the emperors, how these stories get entangled, and how there's no simple narrative. You can't simply say Roman Empire enables slaves to come, although obviously Roman military power, Roman economy did mean it got slaves. Nor is it the case that slavery makes the Roman Empire work. Although it is true, because Rome's a slave-owning society, that they use slaves to run the empire like they use slaves to run everything else. But the stories of slavery and empire are intermingled, and understanding one without the other is really, really difficult. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Greg. That was a fascinating talk and a study of slavery in the Roman world. And it's one that there are a few things that jump out immediately. Of course, recognition of Grumio, which I very much appreciated, Greg, at the start. But also, actually, you really can't separate the two stories, can you? And in one sense, you know, both narratives very much belong together. And yet, like your discussion of the scholarship, you know, demonstrated, we can sometimes try and present an overly simplistic interpretation. There are slaves and thus there's an empire, or there's an empire and you need slaves. But actually, the reality is not just different from early to late Rome, but it's actually different from the city of Rome to other areas, in particular the provinces and things like that. So actually I guess, Greg, it's a really hugely complex issue.
It is, but a fascinating one, and one that's very well documented. We know more about slaves than we know about free people in the Roman Empire.
Excellent. And one thing that also jumps out is that we seem to know more from the imperial period, like you say, because we have these funerary remains, we have these moments of memory that we kind of begin to trace perhaps some of the realities therein. If it's okay with you, Greg, I've got a few questions that jump out, if that's all right.
Please do, yes.
So one that immediately comes to mind then, I don't think you'll be able to answer this straight away, Greg, and I suspect you're probably going to work on it again, is how, if I were to force you to say, okay, what is then the connection between slavery and empire? If it's not that slavery creates empire and empire creates slavery, and we recognize the inherent complexity, how could you respond to that kind of connection, do you think, Greg?
I think the easiest way I find to think about is to say, well, these two happen to be both very central, not the only things that are central, both very central to Roman society. And so when Rome creates an empire, it will always have a slavery flavored empire. The empire will always be slavery flavored. But equally, Rome is all about empire. Now, the Roman Republic is all about expansion. The Roman Empire is all about rule. But they will never do either of those things in ways that don't completely involve slaves. There's almost no aspect of empire that doesn't have a slave dimension, and almost no aspect of slavery that doesn't have an imperial dimension. Yeah. So I think that's the nearest I can get to a quick
Excellent.
answer.
No, I think it's a really good response, Greg, because you just can't separate them, can you? I think, you know, were you ever to fall through time and find yourself in Rome, you'd find yourself facing both things very, you know, quickly. You'd see imperialism, but you'd see slavery, and slavery is kind of everywhere within the empire. We can't just remove it and try and look at it in isolation. So I
think the same thing applies to modern empires, that if you say, try and think about modern empires without capitalism and industrialization, it's really difficult. And there have been wonderful studies done showing how things like, there's a great book called Sweetness and Power about sugar. and it talks about how the connections between capturing, taking slaves to the New World, setting up plantations, sugar cane. Why sugar is important? Because it's vital for preserving foods, but also really important because once people start working factories, they need a quick diet, and so jam, sweetness gives them energy, and so on. And you know, in other ways too, the plantations are linked to industrialization, you know, cotton for cotton mills, jute for jute mills. So again, there are some Marxists who worried for a long time about whether they should be more interested in the class system or about imperialism as a system of exploitation. And the answer is they fit together. It's both of them. And so, yeah, Rome doesn't have capitalism, doesn't have industrialization, but this kind of complex it occurs elsewhere in history.
Yeah, excellent. And for everyone watching, I think this is a really good example of Greg's approach to history. You know, Greg is able to take all these different ideas and coalesce them together, and you create these really persuasive kind of almost panoramic, you know, perspectives and images, Greg. So I, as always, I commend you for that. I find it deeply, deeply impressive. So if we think then we've got slavery and we've got empire, how do you? It's linked to it, Greg. But I just while I've got you, how would you define empire? You know, through the Roman practice of imperial governance.
I think empire is understood mostly by people as being a system in which one population, a people, come to rule over others. And so it's about a ranking. I mean, quite often we see empires appear when a group of states which are all on the same level, if you like, one of them suddenly becomes the top dog. And Romans thought of themselves as an imperial people. In fact, they thought themselves an imperial race, the gens togata. And when we have our discussions about racism and empire, which is another huge topic, you know, one of the key things to notice is that Romans do have a notion of race, but it's not about color or about how big people are or the shape of their face or physiognomy at all. But they still think that Romans are different from Greeks and Greeks are different from Gauls. And so empire, I think, is when one population rules over another. Now, Romans themselves found different ways to describe it. They, at quite a late stage, they decided that there was a kind of divine mandate, that the gods wanted them. And this is rather like the old joke about the British acquiring their empire in a fit of absence of mind, that British conquered most of the globe before discovering that it was an empire, and then the first person who becomes an emperor is Queen Victoria, what normally thought was near the end of the empire building process. So, and it wasn't really, I don't really believe it was legally based. It wasn't a rule-based thing, and there weren't rigid castes, but I think it's that sense that there is a people, the Romans, who dominate. And just as in the Athenian, for Greek history, when you read Thucydides, you know, it doesn't usually say Athens did this and Sparta. It says the Athenians did this, and then the Lacedaemonians did this, or the Corinthians on the other hand. So their world is a world of people jostling together, not of cities or nation states. It's of people. So I think Romans think of empire as, when they call it form, it tends to be imperium populi Romani, the rule, the governance, the authority, the order of the Roman people. So it's that Roman people is always there, even when they've got a monarch at top, an emperor, which they famously didn't have when they were empire building in the Republic. There's still that sense of an imperial race.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Greg. And I think Roman identity, you know, much like everything we're talking about so far today, it is nuanced and it's complex and it shifts. And one thing that again came through from your talk, Greg, was this idea, and I hadn't considered it at all, about the populations of these cities and the way in which actually the immediate population of somewhere like the city of Rome, but also of course other important Roman sites, could be built largely or, you know, substantially by a slave population. You know, that's a remarkable, that creates a really remarkable image.
Some people begun to realise, and partly Andrew Wallace Hadrill working on the epigraphy of Pompeii, of Herculaneum, where we got a lot. But the other thing that's really striking is that sometimes when a city grows, it grows at the expense of lots of others. So in many parts of the global south today, you have one or two enormous cities, and then all the little towns have been stripped their population. But if you look at Italy in the Roman period, at the same time as the city of Rome is growing, lots of the other cities of Italy are growing. And the period of maximum monument building in cities of Italy is the 1st century AD. That's when all the temples and amphitheatres and circuses are put up. So it isn't possible that Rome is growing through sucking people out of, it's not a kind of Dick Whittington thing where people leave all their other towns. Those other towns are also getting bigger. Yeah. So where's the population coming from? They're not breeding faster. It's not demographic growth like in the modern age, which is essentially created by reducing the death rate. Yeah. Roman death rates remained just as high as they'd always been. They had no real way of stopping people hemorrhaging. They had no antibiotics. So the only real solution is bringing in more people. And actually, once you start looking at other ancient empires like the Assyrians and so on, you find when they have a huge city like Nineveh, it's done by forcing people to go there. So it's urbanization by force.
Yeah. And the Assyrians, whenever I think about Assyria, it's all about force and hard power. And we expect that sometimes with Rome, Greg, but it's often actually more subtle, more nuanced than we might ordinarily kind of expect. And I think that's partly, how and why they are successful for so very long.
Yeah, it's very, the ways in which people are brought into society are quite devolved at a lower level. So the emperors don't need to buy 20,000 people a year to fill up the city of Rome, because all the aristocrats are buying a few hundred, or the smaller people are buying 2 or 3. So it's like pyramid sales. It's a system. The fact that with that last bit of evidence I showed you is a world where some poor woman is sold, but she's sold to a slave who's an assistant slave to another slave who's a slave to an emperor. So this is everybody's involved in this at one stage or another.
And I think that's the crucial thing, isn't it, Greg? Everyone's involved. And it always strikes, certainly, I think students, when they're new to studying ancient history or classics and they're thinking about slavery, it's a terrible leap, isn't it, from the 21st century perspective, to think a former slave would seek to enslave others.
Yes.
But again, of course, Greg, that's because of the nature of Roman slavery and what it means to the ancient city and the ancient world more generally. I've just got 2 more questions, if that's okay, Greg. So the first one is, again, it's just quite a big one, but it's to do with as this is the last lecture in the series. How do you understand kind of imperial power working? So in the talk, you spoke about the Familia Caesaris, and we recognize the role of slaves actually almost as power brokers, controlling access to emperors such as Nero and others. How do you think that the system kind of works? I know that's a broad question, Greg.
I think the short answer is the emperors don't try to do very little, but they do it very well. So they're not trying to deal with pandemics or private health system or social care, anything else. They're essentially raising just enough money to keep themselves secure, to protect the frontiers, and to live in a really spectacularly gorgeous lifestyle. But if you've got 60 million people to tax, which is more or less the population of the empire, one person can live very well by extracting just a small amount of what each one of them produces. So they use existing institutions. So the cities that are there already end up doing a lot of the administration. Where there aren't cities, they create new cities and tell them how to do it, and then they get on with it. In some parts of the empire, they're even using tax systems they've inherited. So in Egypt, they're very largely, for a long time, using a tax system that was set up by Macedonian kings. In Sicily, there's this system that King Hiero of Sicily uses to extract tithes from the island. And they just keep it and say, okay, so now you don't pay the king because we got rid of the king, you pay Rome. So they have this Lex Hieronica, the law of King Hiero. And the same thing happens today. So they're good at metabolizing existing systems, and they don't worry about inconsistency. You never seem to get people sitting in the imperial court saying, well, it's not very fair, is it, that in Gaul people pay 2.5% on imports, but in Asia it's nearer 6 or 8%. I mean, shouldn't we have more equitable system? They're not interested in equity. They're not interested in consistency. They have this very limited goal of extracting enough revenue to do what they want to do. So I think that's probably true of most early empires, that they had these very limited goals and they're very good at achieving them. So that's one way they do it. And then trust, they have to trust people. They can't micromanage. You can't micromanage. Even Nero can't micromanage somebody in Britain, because it would have taken a month for the message to get from Britain to Nero that things are not going quite as well as you might imagine after Boudicca was killed.
Yeah.
And then it takes however long it takes to think it over, and then it takes a month for Polykleitos to hike up there and get across the channel. These are minimum time. The empire is 60 days travel across in the summer, worse in winter. So the only way you can run an empire that is that devolved is the same way that you used to run your farms when they were scattered up and down Italy. You find someone you trust and you send them there.
Trust. And it's about people, but also, I guess, it's coming through again from what you're talking about. It's this negotiation, isn't it, Greg? Negotiating with former types of payment, former types of identity, custom, and I think that's partly kind of what Rome does well, and allows it to kind of not necessarily grow, but kind of be stable for so very long, which is perhaps one of its most remarkable achievements. When we think of the types of figures that we've discussed all the way through the series, there were some, like you said in the talk, there were some notably bad emperors, and we don't need to run through each of them. We all know who we're talking about, and yet the empire often survives or survives rather well, in spite of kind of that, those people at the top who are ruling.
I think you've hit on the head with the word negotiation, because it's about fitting in with what works already. It's not about sweeping it all away and creating something new. Maybe 19th, 20th century empires thought they could do that. They could abolish customary courts and set up something modelled on British justice.
Yeah, and
it's
like
enormously expensive and not obviously advance in efficiency.
But also someone like the Assyrian, Greg, or the Neo-Assyrian, they implement their version of life, and that's such a form of hard power, but it's so short-sighted as well. Rome doesn't necessarily always seek to do that. So I think that's part of its kind of success story, I guess.
Yeah, so it wins people over, doesn't it? I mean, the Assyrians, when they fell, everybody hated them. There's a huge pile-in of other nations coming in, was it 612 to destroy the Assyrians. But when Rome more or less collapses in the 3rd century, it's put back together by its subjects.
Yeah.
So it's a group of aristocrats and soldiers up on the Rhine, and it's a client king in Palmyra, and it's Greek citizens in Athens, and most of them still think of themselves as Romans. I mean, for a while there's who's going to be the leader, but there's clearly a lot of people who've got a vested interest in the way things Rome had set it up. They don't want it to collapse.
Yeah,
it's not a hated regime. We're not hated to everybody.
And even perhaps I suspect you'll know this as well as I, probably better, Greg. But even following the fall of the Western Empire, not everything changes, not everywhere, and there's still a strong sense of local identity. Yes, Ostrogothic, particularly focused on Ostrogothic Italy, but a sense of Roman identity as well. It doesn't just disappear.
Yes, Theodoric repairs the Colosseum. They still have shows there. He supports Roman orators in Latin.
Yeah.
People from Africa ruled by the Vandals still trade to Rome. They send ships across, and families connected across these kingdoms. Yeah, it's remarkable. So
even then there's kind of still that element of empire. So just one last question, Greg, if that's okay. And again, it's more from the student perspective, and I'm thinking about some of your recent work. And it's a bit, again, it's a big question, so please do your best with it, Greg. How do you read ancient cities? How should you as a scholar kind of interpret an ancient city, when you're trying to study it and when you're trying to get to grips with it?
That is a big question, isn't it? I mean, I think as many ways as possible, really. I mean, I think if you only look at it through classical descriptions and laws, what you get is an ideal version of a city that maybe does represent something quite important about the thought of Cicero or someone. But if you don't also look at the gravestones, and if you don't also look at how the streets are organized, and there's things that never pop out. Like a friend of mine, Ray Lawrence, did amazing work on the city of Pompeii. One of the things he just showed was that there were no rich and poor quarters there. That most cities we know about have smart areas, the Kensingtons, Chelseas, and they have the less smart areas. But partly because most Roman cities are small, and partly because there's no mass transport, you can't have people commuting to work long distances. There's nothing for them to commute on. So everybody lives close together. So every bit of the city has got rich houses, surrounded by poor people, slaves in the rich houses, ex-slaves just outside them. And so without looking at the physical fabric of the city, you just never know that. You wouldn't really glimpse this from Cicero because he hasn't particularly got those questions in mind. He hasn't got a sociological set of questions to ask. So, and then I suppose just seeing the huge diversity. I mean, I think if one is privileged to be able to visit and travel and go to lots of cities, it's really amazing way to do it. And it was really a family holiday. I hope the family enjoyed it. I'm wandering around cities in Turkey once, and yeah, in a sense, they're all part of the same family. They have Greek inscriptions on marble. They have spectacular theatres and so on. Every city was different. There's cities that are right up high, thoroughly wooded. The ones on rather barren plains, amazing views. There were cities which could be completely lived around a port that's now silted up. There are cities that still looked up to an acropolis, even though it's massively inconvenient on the Roman period to still got there, but that's where the gods lived, so you had to go up there. So getting that sense of the diversity of ancient cities, that seems to me to be much, much more important than finding an elaborate sociological formula for what the ancient city was like. And when you read ancient texts, like, I don't know, Apuleius or something, they never seem to think that each city is the same as every other. So
excellent, thank you, Greg. And I think it's a really difficult question, but I think it's a really important one, just obviously because of your work, but also because, as you say, there is diversity here. You know, much like there is across the empire, actually within the city itself. And I often think if we can understand the cities and recognize that, we can begin to get perhaps a more true perspective of actually what the ancient empire really looked like, and recognize the combination between Roman identity and local identity or local culture, and how nuanced that could be all across this vast dominion.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, hopefully, anyway, Greg. So that was the last of my questions. Hopefully, Greg, you've not got any for me. Good, fine.
No, well, thank you again for inviting me. It's been lovely to take part in this talk. And as I said to Anthony before, well, a particular pleasure is that my father did his education in St John's when it was a teacher training college, I think, at the time. So it's sort of nice virtually at any rate to come back here.
Excellent. Well, hopefully we'll be able to get you in person at some point, Greg, although of course you're moving off to California. So what I'd like to do then, everyone, is just on behalf of obviously myself and the university, but also everyone else who's watching, thank you, Greg. That was a fascinating talk, a brilliant talk, really thought-provoking, and also the questions and the answers after were absolutely brilliant. So thank you, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.